point, feel free after my introduction to mingle about. You don't have to follow me around from case to case, because you're online, of course. I'll point out to the audience here that's present, there are additional items in the reading room, and you are free to go peruse those items if you want. You don't need any special equipment. You don't need to wear gloves or anything like that. If you do, though, be very careful. Some of the bindings are very fragile, and obviously be very delicate pages. But those are you're free to go and take a look at those at your leisure. Okay. So I think what I'll do first is just give some acknowledgments and some thank yous. So I want to primarily thank my fellow curators on this exhibit, Ruth Ann and Marco. Ruth Ann was instrumental. He's running the camera right there. Ruth Ann was instrumental in gathering the texts, securing them, in some cases talking to other libraries to get journals. Did a lot of the behind the scenes work to make sure that all the items were in place, and many other tasks besides, many things. So Ruth Ann, thank you so much. I want to thank Marco for all his work doing conservation here. Marco was the conservationist for this project. He made sure all the texts were in great shape for display, but he did much more than that. All of the arrangements you see in each of these cases, all that artistry is Marco's doing. So it's really fantastic. So this looks so good because of what Marco did. So a few more people I want to acknowledge, Katie Pullen right there, and Anna Rodriguez. They helped with the curation process and also with setting up the exhibit. In the geology department, I want to thank two people. I want to thank Gillen Wood for introducing me to the Rare Books and Manuscript Library, and introducing me to some of these phenomenal texts that are here. And also I thank Gillen for reintroducing the geology department as a whole to this space. And just a note to the geology faculty here, or really any faculty that are teaching any classes, this is a space that's available for you to bring students to, and just like those books are laid out in that reading room, you can bring students to come look at this as well. Obviously not the ones that are behind glass, it's not until after July, but this is a resource that's at our disposal. So thank you, Gillen, for reconnecting the department. I also want to thank Max Christie. Max supplied, where's Max? There, Max supplied the fossils that you see in case 2, helped with that selection, and helped match them with some of the imagery there. A few more people to thank. I want to thank Jill Thomas, who was the graphic designer that made all these beautiful brochures, the posters you've seen around this particular image above me, a lot of the digital signage. Thank you, Jill. I think she's tuned in, so thank you, Jill. And finally, thank Lynn Thomas, no relation, Jill, but Lynn is the director of the RBML, and she's the one who provided us with the space and the time to do this. So thank you, Lynn. Oh, and one final thing, thanks to the National Science Foundation, which partially supported it. Thank you, NSF. So I want to give a little introduction for the motivation for doing this exhibit, and then we'll kind of break up. And those of you that want to follow me on the tour can follow me on the tour. Those of you who want to go off and look at the cases on your own, or go look at the items in the reading room, can go ahead and do so. And the motivation for this is there's several reasons to do this exhibit. One is that the space we're in, the Rare Books and Manuscript Library, is a world-class resource. Very few universities in the country, or indeed the world, have access to the kinds of texts that are available here. And a particular gem in the Rare Books and Manuscript Library are the geologic or earth science rare manuscript texts that are available here. So part of the motivation was to reconnect the departments to this library. And I should say that connection is actually quite special, because a former professor in the department, Albert Ferozzi, was really instrumental in securing a lot of these texts, identifying many of the texts, cataloging a lot of the texts. So this is in part, many of the items you see here are his legacy, and unfortunately he passed 2 years ago, I believe 2014. So a lot of this is, the primary motivation here was to reconnect the department to RBML in some fashion. Then there's sort of the motivations of the interest of materials here. And I'll sort of talk about my own personal interest, and hopefully that sparks some of your interest as well. And maybe you can ask some questions to go along. And so my interest is several-fold. I was, I think as a geologist, my main scholarship is in research. And so I always really want to understand where ideas come from, what's the origin of an idea. And I think for those of us that work in the scientific literature, we often write introductions and background sections, and we explore in those sections where, the genesis of an idea, at least a little bit far back in time, right, a few decades. This exhibit is really about exploring the origin of ideas as far back as we can do it, right? And the ideas in these cases come in a couple of different fashions. There's one set of ideas, just the facts, right? The facts that we have that sort of persistent in modern geology. The observations, the set of observations, the origin of those, that's interesting. And you'll see some of that in these cases. A little bit more interesting, I would argue, is the origin of modes of thought or frameworks of thought for the different ideas that persist into modern geology. And so I really want to focus on that. Not so much specific facts, where a specific name came from or a specific rock came from, although I will talk about that because it's very interesting. But I want you to be thinking about, as we look at these cases, how the framework in which the savants, that are the authors of many of these texts, were operating, and the degree to which those frameworks of thought persist into our modern science. So that's a really key theme that I hope to explore as we go on the tour. The other really interesting thing to me working on this was understanding the ideas in context. So understanding the validity of the idea, the validity of the frame of thought, how the savant writing at a particular time which they're writing, what's the context of the idea? How well received was that? How controversial was it? And how much does that debate about how well received or not it is persistent into the modern science? I think geology is particularly interesting in this respect, maybe not unique amongst the sciences, but distinct amongst the sciences, is that much of the record that we confront as earth science geologists is in some ways static. The rocks are always the same rocks, whether someone's looking at them in the 18th century versus the 19th century versus the 21st century. But as you'll see as we go along the cases, the frameworks, the modes in which people are thinking about those rocks changes a lot from century to century. And that's really what I hope to focus on as we go through the cases here. So just a quick outline of the way the exhibit's set up, and that'll be the end for the introduction. And then those of you that want to accompany me can, and those of you who want to go on your own way and look at the reading room, you can do that as well. But the outline of the exhibit is broadly speaking, cases 1 through 4 are going to follow the progression, the evolution of the idea that the Earth is not only very old, but has a distinctive history that is separate and apart from human history. So that's cases 1 through 4. And we follow that story through a couple of different sub-disciplines of geology. And in each case, this case within itself proceeds chronologically. So we'll see the evolution of thought, of the history of the Earth within a given sub-discipline. Cases 5 and 6 are all about how we came to actually put absolute ages on some of that history. So you can almost view that as the distinctiveness of the atomic age versus pre-atomic age, right? The story in cases 5 and 6 really comes into talking about radioactive decay and the discovery of the atom, right? So that's the very broad overview of the way that this exhibit is structured. I'll take any immediate questions right now, and then we'll move on to cases. And before I take any questions, let me just mention that for the rest of this, I really want this to be a dialogue. I really hope there's a lot of different perspectives and viewpoints here. Some people from geology, I think there's people from other departments here as well that have things to contribute. I could talk for 5 hours about all the stuff here. Don't make me do that, right? Please interject. Please come up with your own questions and your own comments, right? But for now, I'll just pause, and if anyone has anything immediately they want to say, then we'll proceed to the case. Yeah.
So are all these books from a European perspective? Have any books from that?
Yeah, so many of these are European centric. They're focused primarily on the centuries from the 18th century to the present. The library, that's the majority of the collection of the library that has created by Perosi. But you bring up a really good point, which is it's important to remember that this is one particular viewpoint on the Earth and one particular view on Earth's history or the history of Earth. And it is from a very European-centric perspective. And one thing maybe we could do is we could weave in as we go into the cases about how some other forms of knowledge might have sort of settled some of these debates at the time, which it was mostly just European savants talking. But yes, this is a sort of European centered art.
Your idea about tracing things back to the beginning. But Rose part really into rare books. Only the part of George White. It's the one that sort of started the whole tradition. Trying to go for rare books. Right went through the department's old files to find telegrams from faculty that were traveling to a conference. So he asked faculty to go to their bookstores wherever they went to find something. And they telegraph back and say, oh, I found a copy of that. Oh, wow. So I get it.
That now.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, what's the budget?
Willie, you have to repeat the questions so that they can
Okay,
be heard.
yes, I will do that now. All right, my apologies for those. Okay, so I think with that, we can go ahead and break. And those of you that want to listen to me some more, we can do that. We'll kind of try to gather in as close as we can. Not too close, perhaps. I'll talk about each of the cases here. Okay, so I'll turn my voice down a little bit. So this is the first case, and I struggle a little bit with what to refer to this as. So it's called religious chronologies. But it's really a case that's focused on texts that have a distinctively theological background, theological influence to them in thinking about the age of the earth. And some of these texts actually will probably be familiar to some of you who have taken a history of geology class. James Ussher's Bible is here for those of you who are interested. And it's important, this is sort of our first example of thinking about context in which these authors were working and whether or not, you know, the debate at the time in which the text. Okay. Interestingly enough, in some cases here, in some of these examples here, there are ideas that even though these texts are have a very theological background to them, there are ideas or modes of thought that actually do still persist. Two items here. The first is Thomas Burnet's Sacred Theory of the Earth from 1697. As Gillen was pointing out earlier before I started talking, this text is in amazing condition. It's one of the oldest ones here on display. And Burnet's, there are previous theories of the earth, but Burnet is perhaps arguably the first one to use that phrase, theory of the earth. It was sacred, which tells you kind of some of the context in which he was working. I should define a little bit what a theory of the earth was or is or was back at the time in which many of these savants were working. The theory of the earth was an attempt to completely reconstruct, or I should say retrodict back into the past how it was operated, therefore predict into the future how it was going to operate. There are various shades of theories of the earth. Some were sort of all encompassing. In other words, you could boil everything down in the earth to very retrodictable or predictable natural laws. Now they're shaded more into historical contingency, opposed to strictly theory. Burnet's theory, sacred theory of the earth, is obviously religiously influenced, and in particular has a Christian imprint to it. But it's decidedly not a literal interpretation of the history of the earth. That's actually fairly important. Burnet was interested in retrodicting the history of the earth using natural observation. So he was very much invested in using the present as a key to the past. He also, a couple of other interesting things about this particular theory is that it is a finite theory. In other words, the earth has a beginning and has an end. There's a vast amount of time with which to work there for Burnet, but that actually distinguishes it from some of the other theories of the earth that we'll talk about, especially when we get to Hutton's case, which was an eternal theory of the earth as opposed to a finite one. One other interesting aspect of Burnet's work is that he divides the different stages of the earth, which he refers to as epochs, and breaks them apart based on different revolutions that occur from epoch to epoch. So for those of you who are familiar with sort of the way that we reconstruct the geologic time scale, you can kind of see some of those ideas have persisted into the modern geology. Now, clearly, you look at the image here, he places Christ above all of it, right? So there is sort of behind the scenes here, has a religious influence to it. But that should, again, you want to think about this in the context in which it was written. The extent to which certain frameworks of thought persist into the modern, whereas others may have been discarded by modern geology.
So when you say the Earth, right now we talk about Earth, we think of the Earth system. So when he's saying Earth, what does Earth mean in that time, that perspective shift?
Yeah, so the question is, when he's talking about Earth, what is he referring to in terms of the Earth system? So he is particularly talking about the events that just happened to the Earth itself, right? Okay. And he's talking, and you can see here, he's got conveniently 7 different epochs, right? So to match the 7 days of creation. But actually, it's a little bit more detailed than that. You can actually see in some of these the initial creation of the Earth from a fiery, full magma botany. What we in modern science would call a magma ocean, right? You can see the creation of continents. You can see the deluge, right? The Noah's flood. So these epochs are both influenced by the theology that Burnet subscribed to, but at the same time, he grounds himself in sort of natural observation. And again, that idea that the present is the key to the past. He was in full subscription to that idea way back in 1695.
Really, was Burnet, what was his profession? Was he clergy or religious, or do you know what did his background come from to produce those different knowledge?
Yeah, he was clergy. Do you know, Gillen, what he was a clergyman? And actually so the question was, what was Burnet's background? And he was a clergyman. You will see actually in many of these cases, I'm referring to the individuals that wrote many of these things as savants, not as scientists. And scientist is a term that sort of comes about in the later part of the 19th century. Many of these individuals at the time they were writing would have referred to themselves as savants. It's basically just a knowledgeable person. And so many of them had various affiliations with religious bodies. A lot of the savants, the geologists that were working in the early part of the 19th century, people like Buckland and Conybeare, Philip, they were all associated with Oxford. It was an arm of the Anglican Church, right? So many of them have some kind of clergy background. And one thing I'll say about that is that that's not, that was not an hindrance to them sort of advancing ideas about geology that still persists today. There wasn't, we sometimes think about this conflict between religion and science, and for many of these savants, that conflict, at least the time in which this exhibit starts, which is the late 18th century, is not so burning as hot as perhaps it was in past centuries.
It was eating place in the background.
Did experience some backlash because he was advocating first a very long time span with which to work. So it was not a 6,000 year Earth, but it was a vastly long ancient Earth that he was proposing. And he's also calling upon natural processes to explain all of the various phenomena he's talking about, right? So he's not calling on sort of revealed theology that say, a deity comes down and makes something happen. It very much has to be grounded in the natural processes of the Earth. So in some ways, that actually got him in trouble with various members of the church, as opposed to, even though he very clearly calls it a sacred theory of the Earth and puts Christ up above everything. So yeah. Okay, one other one I want to talk about really quickly here is work by Jean-André Deluc. Letters physical and moral. I'm not going to say the whole French word, but Deluc is actually a very interesting figure for a couple reasons. He also is proposing a theory of the Earth. His is binary, meaning that he splits the Earth into 2 parts: a very short human history of the Earth, for which you can use a reference like Ussher's Bible to basically follow the historical record back to, and then a vast pre-human history. So a history of the Earth without humans present. Deluc's interesting for a few other reasons. He coins the phrase actual causes. The present is the key to the past. So the phrase actual causes comes from Deluc. And when he's describing his theory of the earth, the sort of the endeavor in which he's engaged, he calls that geology. And that's the first instance of the use of the geology is coming from this work by Jean-André Deluc. It's very narrowly focused at the time in which Deluc coins that phrase. He's talking very specifically about theories of the earth. As you go around the cases, you'll see the idea of what is part of geology sort of broadens itself and then perhaps starts to narrow again. So it's actually a very interesting discussion given some of the discussions we've had about changing the name of the department. You can kind of see the origin of geology is actually incredibly narrow in terms of its scope. It then sort of becomes broader. And how is it thought of in the modern context? Maybe it's become a little bit narrower, given that we now tend to use phrases like geosciences or earth sciences to be much broader and more encompassing. What was this? So Jean-André Deluc, this is from 1779. This particular thought. Okay, move to case 2. I'm trying to monitor the time. If people, again, people that want to follow, people that want to break off, feel free. I don't want to sort of pain you to following me around necessarily. So, this case is focused on fossils. See by the beautiful specimens that are on display here. Again, thanks to Mac for collecting those. And it's focused on the period slightly before fossils are thought of as markers of Earth's history. And then as you follow the progression of text in the case, we get to the point where they are fully used as historical markers, or what some people refer to as nature's coins, nature's monuments, right? So I want to focus on just a couple of items in this case. I don't have time to talk about all of them. I'll talk about the most eye-catching ones here. There's 2 volumes from Knorr and Waltz's Sammlung von Merkwürdigkeit der Natur and Aufführung des Verbotens, Miracles of Nature, right? And these are fantastic examples of what were referred to at the time as paper museums. Notice for the geologists in the audience that these are specimens that are devoid of any context of the rocks from which they were collected. They're devoid of any context from the region from which they were collected. They simply sit by themselves on the page. This is reflective of a couple of things. One, many of these specimens you see here were privately owned or held by museums and were not accessible to all its savants throughout all of Europe, either due to travel, if it was difficult to travel to the museum, or if it's a private collection, you might not necessarily have access to. So volumes like this, the Paper Museum, went to great lengths to tremendous detail on the fossils so that you as an individual could buy the volume and basically experience as well as you could without having the actual physical specimen on hand. The other key thing is that, right, as I mentioned, they're devoid of any rock context. They're devoid of any layer context, which we'll talk about in a second. And that's not by accident. Most of the work on these fell into the realm of what we would refer to as natural history. Natural history in the traditional sense of the word, meaning the study of simply the classification, the ordering, the taxonomy of the fossils, not necessarily using the fossils as an historical record. I picked these 2 in particular because they both have interesting ways in which they persist throughout into the 19th century and actually persist to the modern. So the bottom one is showing a class of animals called ammonites. These are cephalopods. The most closely related extant organism for this would be the nautilus, the pearly nautilus. They're quite distinctive from nautiluses, though, in that if you look closely, the shells are very rigid and ribbed, and that is not something that you see in a modern-day nautilus. The other thing that's really unique about them, and you can see it really well on this particular specimen, is that the suture pattern on the ammonite has this beautiful sort of dendritic pattern. That's very much not like the nautilus. The reason these are so important at the time in which this is written, or very shortly after the time in which it was written, is that they were one of the more solid pieces of information that animals went extinct. In other words, that extinction events did actually occur. At the end of the 18th century, there are kind of 3 competing ideas about what happens to fossils that we don't find living today. We don't find living examples today. One is that they go extinct. And the ammonites are great examples of this. They're found only in particular low down in what are referred to as the secondaries. And then suddenly they disappear. And there's no living example of secondary rocks being the sedimentary pile, as it's referred to at that time. There's no living examples of them at the present. So one idea is extinction. The other idea is migration, in that, sure, ammonites aren't found anywhere in the modern oceans, and that's simply because they've migrated somewhere else to deeper water. That's actually a quite plausible idea in the late 18th century, because much of the oceans, as today, much of the oceans are under-examined, undiscovered, right? And one thing that really strengthens the argument for living fossils is around this time period, the late 18th century. For those of you who are geologists, you'll know what a crinoid is. Those are sort of the donuts that you find in limestone rocks, and sometimes you find whole columns of donuts, right? Those were long thought to be extinct. Expeditions in the late 18th century dredged up living sea lilies from the ocean bottom. A living fossil was found. Lo and behold, migration is a pretty plausible explanation for some of the fossils that we don't see alive today. The third theory, which is most closely associated with savant Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, is transformation or transmutation. That has sort of carries on into the later theory of evolution put forth by Darwin, but it is distinct from evolution in a couple of ways. Lamarck's theory of transformation says that basically all living creatures on Earth today are the direct continuum ancestor of some animal in the past. So there is no extinction, except unless humans do it, such as killing off the dodo, right? But that there's no extinction. The other key thing that separates Lamarck's theory from later Darwinian evolution is that the origin of species is left unexplained by Lamarck. That's actually the crucial thing that Darwin eventually does, is he explains how species originate. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Lyle. Okay, I'll just mention one more really interesting one here, and that's the fossil plant you see up top. That's some variety of fossil fern, and there's a corresponding image, corresponding fossils next to it. These fossils are very interesting because they're found in particular layer in Europe, the coal-bearing units, which are very important economic value. A long debate at this time was whether these plants were actually found in situ, meaning were the leaves actually dropping in the rocks where the plant died? And actually required later work by Adolphe Brongniart to find tree stumps in the coal-bearing unit to sort of solidify that argument. Yes, they were in situ, they were not sort of blown in or moved in by some sort of mega tsunami event. Later savants will look at these fossil plants and actually reconstruct a history of plant evolution, a directional history to the plants themselves. And that's again, Alexandre Brongniart pieces together through the rock record that the first fossil plants found are the fossil ferns. Then later, higher up in the rock layers, we see the gymnosperms, and then higher still, we see the angiosperms. Right? And so the fossil plants are used as a very persuasive argument for a directional or progressive change through geologic history of the fossil work. One more I'd like to quickly just mention here is some fantastic trilobites. I've already talked a lot, so we'll kind of move on from that. If people want to talk about the trilobites, I can kind of circle back to that a little bit later. Okay, any questions about case 2? Right. So these volumes would have been prohibitively expensive. That's one other thing about sort of science at this time period. It is very much an elitist pursuit. Because you required sort of a lot of wealth to either own things like the paper museums, own really nice volumes like this, and it required a lot of wealth to kind of be able to have the leisure to go out and do field work. And so a lot of these savants were working, either they had another profession which paid them handsomely, or they inherited significant amounts of money, which allowed them to. Yeah, so that's, I think that there's actually a lot of sort of interesting discussion about the moral judgment there of elitism at this time period. But it is sort of the fact that many of this was a sort of an elite pursuit at the time in which much of this work was done.
Smaller version, just with only.
So actually, that's a really, I wasn't going to talk too much about it, but there's actually an example in this case of a much later volume, which is the Gideon Mantel, the center image there from 1839. This is about a half century after the Norton Vultch here, and that is a much more popularly distributed book. So by the late 1830s, and really the dividing line here is Charles Lyell and his Principles. Post Charles Lyell and the Principles, sort of the market for geology texts really escalates amongst sort of the broader public. And at that point, yes, more broad, literate, educated, not the upper echelons of society would have had access to texts like that. And that this one by Gideon Mantel is specifically targeted to get to those broader audiences, as opposed to sort of the very elites to which these volumes would have been targeted.
Yeah. So, are there examples of texts that are basically denying that this was life, given your case one sort of arguments?
So at this point, so these are written there's a sort of time span here, 1755 to 1774. By this point, it's well accepted that fossils are evidence of organisms, that they are not accidental, some sort of weird mineral concretion, but they are actually previous life that has become fossilized. And this is after Steno and Hooke, and it's really Steno and Hooke who sort of established that notion. Steno using sort of shark fossils from various deposits in Italy, Hooke looking at petrified wood under the microscope and seeing cellular structure. And so by those two findings, by this point, this sort of broadly consensus view that yes, that actually was at one point a living plant, that was actually at one point a living cephalopod. Okay, we'll go to page 3. Okay, so this case is the history of the layers of the Earth. And this is sort of the science that a modern geologist would refer to as stratigraphy. That term is actually coined by William Smith, and so we'll get to that in just a moment. But basically, the various items in this case would have been doing some form of stratigraphy, even though they might not necessarily have been referring to it as such at the time in which they were working. And what we see in this case is if you follow the full progression from this Whitehurst volume all the way to the Buckland volume, is we see a transformation of looking at the layers of the Earth from purely a ordering, so a natural history or a desire to get the order of the history of the layers of the Earth correct, to one which is completely enriched in a geohistorical record, right? Something that tells you about the history of former worlds. Initial attempts at describing the layers of the Earth were primarily coming from the mineralogy departments, those that were interested in natural resources and mining. And it was all about order. It was all about establishing a sequence of events. So there's temporal characteristics to this, right? They typically divide this between primary layers, which would have been the crystalline bedrock, so things like granites and gneisses. Overlying those would have been the secondaries, which would have been all the sedimentary rocks. And there's some temporal nature built into that. Clearly, by just the dint of the name, they thought the primaries came first, secondaries came second, and then within the secondaries, we have the laws of superposition at this point from Steno, so you could sort of work out a temporal order. But within those layers, there's not necessarily historical perspective. There's not necessarily the ability to reconstruct histories from those layers. And so I want to talk about two items here which sort of show that progression of thought, that sort of change in the framework of thought. The first one I want to talk about is James Hutton's theory of the Earth. And I think it's worth it to spend a little bit of time with this volume. It's so well known modern geologist. And this is a really cool example of the theory of the Earth. That's a first edition. That's the original image of the outline conformity at Jedburgh. And next to it is a proof of the theory of the Earth with the author's handwriting on the cover page. So pretty phenomenal set of text there. So it's worth spending some time talking about Hutton because Hutton has achieved an almost mythological status in geology, right? He's commonly referred to as the founder of geology. So it's worth diving into the context in which Hutton was working and think about what he was actually proposing and what parts of his theory of the Earth actually persist into the modern day. So as I already mentioned in case one, at this time in which Hutton was writing, there's already a pretty well-established consensus view amongst the savants, so the scientific elite, that we're working with vast amounts of time. There isn't a vast expanse of time available to work with. That's not an original idea to Hutton. It's sort of the milieu in which he's working, right? That has been established through geologists such as Burnet and Fuchsel and Arduino, and actually I've got an additional item for you to look at in the reading room, and that's William Hamilton's study of Mount Vesuvius. Hamilton had already proposed or already looked at the very many layers that make up Vesuvius and arrived at the conclusion that to build up this huge edifice of a mountain, a volcano, to account for all the craters that lied around Vesuvius, you had to be working with vast amounts of time. At the time Hutton's writing, it's also pretty well established that the present is the key to the past. I already mentioned how Jean-André de Luc, whose theory of the Earth precedes Hutton's, has already started to use the phrase actual causes, right? And so it's generally accepted practice by savants this time that, yes, of course, to understand the past, you have to look at how things behave in the present in their natural state. So those two things don't make Hutton distinct. What makes Hutton distinct from the rest of his savants, his colleagues, is that he's proposing an Earth that is eternal, an infinite Earth, and one that is in steady state. So essentially an Earth that is ahistorical. What I mean by that is that you could look at any one of the layers that Hutton detailed here, and you wouldn't see anything distinctive about that particular time period in Earth history, because the Earth is infinite, and there's constant steady state churn of the rock layers. Now, some of that framework does persist into sort of modern geology, right? We think of the rock cycle. The really key thing, Hutton definitely contributes to that notion. But what makes Hutton controversial at the time he's writing, and the idea that has certainly not persisted into our modern geologic thinking, is the idea that the Earth is either infinite, right? When he's saying there's no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, right? He's being literal, right? That's a very literal statement. So the Earth is not ahistorical, and it's finite, right? And that is an idea that has not persisted. In fact, we see a key piece of evidence that changes the minds of many savants from an ahistorical, infinite, steady state Earth as proposed by Hutton to one that is directional, historical, and progressive, right? That the fossil record progresses through time. Okay, so the other item in this case then is this fantastic study by Pouvier and Bronyard. This is published here in Pouvier's research on fossil quadrupeds. It's actually kind of at the tail end of this, but this was a work that Georges Pouvier and Alexandre Brongniart pursued over many decades, and this is kind of the summary figure here, this volume from 1812. And I really encourage you to spend some time looking at this. The level of detail in this is amazing. On the lower left-hand, this is the Paris Basin, the rocks of the Paris Basin. On the lower left-hand corner is Pouvier and Bronyard's ideal section of the Paris Basin. They have reconstructed the rock record from the characteristic fossils within each layer. And that's the really crucial key here that separates this from sort of any previous study, right? They're not identifying or correlating rock layers based on their, what we would say is their lithologies, on their rock types, right? They're correlating rocks based on the characteristic fossils that are present. And that's a really sort of foundational shift in the way that geologists and savants thought about Earth layers. The other really crucial thing that separates this study from sort of all their previous ones, and actually distinguishes it a little bit from William Smith, who we'll get to in just a second, is that Pouvier and Bronyard reconstruct the environments in which these rocks are being deposited. So they are doing depositional environments. They're looking at the history and reconstructing the environment in which the rock formed. And really crucially, if you look in detail in the ideal section in the lower left, you'll see that there's actually they identify two freshwater formations separated by marine layers. So this denotes that there's a very contingent set of events that's happened in the Paris Basin. We have not seen just a steady standard model fall in sea level. In fact, what we've seen is the seas have transgressed into Paris Basin and then regressed, and we've got freshwater formations, and then we've actually done that a couple of times. And Pouvier and Bronyard show that you wouldn't know that unless you looked at the rocks, unless you looked at the fossil record. So this is a historical record and it's a contingent one. That's really, really crucial. The other really fascinating thing for those of you who are taking sedimentology and stratigraphy is that you'll see that Pouvier and Bronyard have placed two units directly next to one another of different mythologies. And they've done that because they contain the same characteristic fossils. So they know that they're the same age, and yet they're different species. That word was not yet invented at the time, or not yet coined at the time that Pouvier and Bronyard were looking at this, but basically they're doing species analysis. And this is one of the first examples of that in the literature. So, I don't mean to diminish Hutton too much, but Pouvier and Bronyard's study of the Paris Basin is a true kind of game changer in changing the framework in which we think about the layers of the Earth. Any questions? Yeah.
Transformation, primary, secondary, tertiary rock.
Right. So Steve is asking about, Steve's question is, when did we drop off the primary, secondary, tertiary distinction? And actually, that's actually kind of an interesting point to jump off of real quick, which is at this point in which Pouvier and Bronyard are writing, and the point in which Hutton is writing, the word tertiary has not yet entered the lexicon. It's actually the Paris Basin will become the basis for the type section for the tertiary layers. And it will be Bronyard's work with other savants such as Giovanni Brocchi, the sub-Apennines, where they will piece together that there's a whole separate sequence of rocks that overlies the chalk, the White Cliffs of Dover. There's a whole sequence of rocks that sits on top of it. So at this time, in both Hutton's time and then a little bit later in 1812, when Pouvier and Bronyard are working, they're still referring to these rocks as primary, secondary. Now, it's Hutton's big proposal is that distinction is not so valid because you can have primary rocks, what we're referred to as primary rocks, that are actually much younger than secondary rocks. In other words, you can have a temporal sequence by which granites will intrude overlying secondaries. And that really is a crucial part of Hutton's theory, and that he deserves a lot of credit. But again, that's sort of an ahistorical perspective. Hutton sees that as a never-ending cycle, and that if you look in particular at any layer within the secondary, you can't piece together a distinctive time in Earth's history. So the idea of calling secondary layers Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Cretaceous, Jurassic, right? That would have been anathema to Hutton. That you could reconstruct a former world, a former Jurassic world, or a former Cambrian world that was distinctive from all other points in Earth history. That is not sort of what is incorporated into Hutton's theory.
Well, I got a question about how the different authors cite each other, or maybe that's an inappropriate word.
Yeah.
They very explicitly say when they're building on older ideas, or is it kind of woven in? Some of the stuff I've looked at actually is more the last.
Yeah, it's not really explicit necessarily, and there's not peer review. And some authors, right, will mention sort of in the acknowledgements, typically. And so, for especially the book example, they'll acknowledge at the very beginning something like, I acknowledge such and such for helping me see this particular idea. But then in the rest of their text, they won't necessarily, it's not like modern science writing where you very clearly denote this idea came from this source, this idea came from that source. One thing though I will say about Hutton, and the reason that Hutton is actually sort of so important to later savants, is because Lyell very directly draws from Hutton, right? So Hutton at the time was not was controversial, and not very many people outside Scotland, and in particular Edinburgh, didn't necessarily agree with Hutton's theory. It's later, due to John Playfair's sort of rewriting of the theory. And the other thing too I should say about Hutton is that the book itself is quite impenetrable. Playfair basically rewrites it and strips away a lot of sort of the deistic theology that's in the book, and that makes it more palatable. And then the other key thing that happens is Lyell, of course, revives Huttonian theory when he talks about his uniformitarianism, and that's really what makes Hutton so important as a sort of a progenitor of Lyell's particular theories of the earth, which we're going to get to in that case. But that's actually, Hutton deserves a lot of credit for that, because Lyell is drawing directly from sort of Hutton's steady state model of the theory of the earth to promote his own sort of principles of theology.
But it sounds like sometimes it's a little bit difficult to follow the trail of ideas.
That's correct. That's correct. Although, there is a lot, there are various societies that are formed by this time, right? The Geological Society in Great Britain comes into existence in the very earliest 19th century. And many of those meetings were basically where these sorts of things would be hashed out. And there were always presidential addresses at many of these societies. So whoever, much like today, that was a rotating position, right? The president would hold that position for 1 year, and each year they give an annual address, and then at that annual address, they'd sort of summarize all of the key questions and debates that were going on at that time period. So it was really at the societies, and then within the museums, which had, so the museum in Paris, for example, which had Pouvier and Lamarck, those two had an active, long-standing debate between one another, and that debate sort of was manifest in the fact that they were seeing each other in the museum all the time. So we'll move on to case 4. This case is maps and cross sections. You can really think of this as somewhat of a continuum with case 3 here. Many of these are same ideas are being shown in this. They're partly split into 2 because of size restrictions. But the other reason to split them into 2 is that there is, whereas those are mostly looking at a cross section through the earth, right? Looking at the layers sort of as you would see them in an outcrop. This one contains a map, an extremely vivid map at that. This is William Smith's Strata of England and Wales. This is a first edition. It's just from an aesthetic standpoint, it's a beautiful thing to look at. So spend some time looking at this. The colors, which are showing the different geologic units, are all watercolor done by hand. For those of you who are geology classes, when this is not on display in the case, you can request it and show in the reading room, and you can flip through it, right? And this is a really fascinating thing to spend a little bit of time on for a couple of reasons. Geologic maps had existed in the past, right? So again, thinking about the context in which Smith was working. Geologic mapping had been done most extensively in France and in parts of Germany. Those maps were primarily focused, again, from a mining perspective. So they would show the discrete localized outcrops of units that were important for mining interests. What Smith has done here is he's color-coded this map across vast expanses of the English countryside. And it's an amazing piece of work because Smith was doing this basically by himself and on foot. It was a multi-year project, and actually, in some ways, he got scooped by other members of the Geological Society, and there's sort of a whole interesting kind of fight that happened between Smith, Renault, Pouvier, and Phillips about who actually constructed the first map of England and Wales, but Smith does deserve credit. But it was partly because he was working by himself that it took so long. The other thing, too, is actually very interesting about William Smith is, unlike many of the other authors here, he was not sort of a cultural elite. He was what we would refer to as, what they refer to as a professional geologist, which actually placed him kind of lower on the class structures. He was a canal digger, and his job took him all throughout England and Wales, on canal projects. That's part of the way he got sort of this great perspective on what the underlying strata looked like. Smith also coins the phrase strata or stratigraphy. So what he's doing is stratigraphy, and he's the first one to use that phrase, even though others were doing it at the same time, or roughly at the same time. The other thing that's exceptional about this map is that Smith does all of his correlation, again, not based on the rock type, but on characteristic fossils within each layer. And that's what allows him to see isolated outcrops in the countryside and then draw those outcrops as they revolt and across the entire English countryside. For those of you who have ever done geologic mapping, you'll appreciate how difficult it is to imagine doing it without a framework of how to do it. And you begin to appreciate sort of the monumental work that went into the creation of this map. This is showing the whole map here on the wall. This is a facsimile or reproduction. But what you're looking at here is one particular area. It's the area around Bath with Bristol, and that's the area from which Smith came from. And so it's the most detailed, maybe because the geology is the most interesting, also probably because Smith was the most familiar with that part of the country. The way this volume is constructed is that if you turn the page, each page is a different section of the broader map here. Okay. The other key piece of text is much smaller. This volume, but it's one that we should spend a little bit more time talking about. That's Charles Lyell's Elements of Geology. At the time that this was written in 1839, Lyell had already written several editions of the Principles of Geology, and many of the ideas in the Principles are sort of also show up in the Elements. There are a second edition of the Principles of Geology is in the reading room. You should all go take a look at it when I'm done talking here, or you go look at it now if you want to go. I'm not holding you here to this. So it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about Lyell because he is such a key figure, especially in the 1830s or the mid 19th century in geology. And what makes Lyell unique is he is one of the first savants to write for a broader educated public. So he's not just communicating to his fellow elites, he's communicating to his fellow elites, but also sort of the broader scientifically literate, scientifically interested reading public. And he's extremely persuasive. He's a barrister by trade, he's a lawyer, so he uses very lawyerly language, but most importantly, very logical language that you don't need to be sort of involved in the minutiae of geology to fully understand what Lyell is talking about. And so it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about what Lyell is laying out. Lyell also proposes a sort of steady state theory of the Earth, except what he's proposing is an extreme form of uniformitarianism. Actually, that's really crucial because what Lyell does is he sets the debate in the mid-19th century, which comes to be defined as the debate between uniformitarianists and catastrophists. He's not the one that coins that phrase, but it's definitely the principles that sets that out. And it requires all other savants that are thinking about geology at this time to sort of grapple with what Lyell is proposing. So let's spend just a little bit of time talking exactly about what that is. As I mentioned already, in many of these examples, the savants have already sort of ingrained the idea that the present is the key to the past. Like that's the way to pursue and look at the rock record. What Lyell is saying is that the only way to reconstruct the past is to think of present action as witnessed by humans. So what's an example of that? We know in the modern sense of the geology that there are volcanic eruptions that have occurred in the past that were much more vigorous, much larger than, say, anything that we've directly observed. Yellowstone is a great example of that, right? Lyell is saying that you cannot call a very large-scale eruption, a large eruption of that magnitude, unless someone had been there to witness it, unless it was something that was operating exactly as we see it in present day. So, aspects of that actually persist all the way to the modern day. And that's actually a really good, that becomes a really key point of discussion throughout the 20th century. That debate is somewhat overturned, especially in the later part of the 20th century when we begin to key on to the idea of extinction events, large impactors, right, which are catastrophic events. But this notion of extreme uniformitarianism kind of sets the terms of debate, sets the discussion going forward from Lyell's time, basically all the way to the present. One other crucial thing that Lyell does is his record is somewhat ahistorical, but it has an historical aspect to it, in that he does reconstruct a full history of the tertiary period. And he does so based on fossil assemblages. So it's really quite novel what he does. He looks at the layers of stratigraphy in the tertiary, major tertiary basins, and he says fossil assemblages of which a certain percentage reflect the modern or extant species, so say 95% extant, those would be the Pliocene assemblage, meaning most recent or most like recent. Miocene rocks would be less recent, so somewhere in the 10% region. Eocene rocks would be dawn of recent because they had almost no extant fossils that today. So much of the concept of tertiary geohistory and tertiary delineation comes from Lyell. And so while he proposes a steady state theory of the Earth that might at first blush look to be ahistorical, at least for the tertiary, he's very much talking about historical and progressive nature of life. So using or incorporating some of the ideas of Hutton, but greatly expanding Hutton's initial theory of the Earth. Okay.
What year are we talking about? How does that relate to Darwin?
So, yeah, so the Elements is 1839. The Principles comes out in the early 1830s. And Darwin's Origin of Species is 1859. I think that's correct. So predating Darwin, Darwin is probably Lyell's most devout disciple in a way, if I can use that phrase. He very much subscribes to Lyell's extreme uniformitarianism. And it's actually, but what's interesting is when Darwin begins to branch out, and so Darwin was a trained geologist, all of his sort of training, and he's thought of himself as a geologist on all the expeditions. When he actually proposed the Origin of Species, it is actually a break from Lyell's particular theorizing about how species came into existence. Lyell thought of species as basically originating or being created or like piecemeal, so that every once in a while a species would originate somehow. And to be fair to Lyell, he actually, one of the things he did was he identified that that's the key question that needs to be addressed. We have no geologists cannot really say where species originate. We can only say that they did actually, in fact, originate. So Lyell is very much a believer in piecemeal origin and then piecemeal extinction. But crucially, he doesn't see in that sort of continuum from which a species comes into existence and then goes extinct. He's very much against sort of Lamarckian transformation. So there's no kind of way that that species can transform itself, which makes it very much not Darwinian evolution, right? The species is a discrete unit that is unchanging through its time period. It doesn't beget any other natural selection. The principles, yeah. Principles of geology in the early 1830s, and then Elements sort of, after subsequent editions of Principles, which is multi-volume, Lyell kind of broke off parts of that.
Constant input, or is it like
well, that's actually really interesting. That's a really that's an interesting question. I would say that Lyell kind of demonstrates the market for that kind of text. I'm not sure the extent to which Lyell identified that there was this huge market available. I mean, I guess he did because he clearly wrote it with the general reading public in mind. More, he was motivated to the idea that there should be sort of principles laid out. In other words, there's all these discussions and debates, in particular, a really hot topic of debate at that time, which I could talk a little bit more about if you're interested, was sort of the diluvial theories, right? The sort of pre-deluge, post-deluge, why did sort of large mammals go extinct, somehow related to Noah's flood, right? So Lyell very much wanted to sort of make an argument against that, but also sort of set the terms of debate, right? Set the so that the principles of geology could be known by the broader public. Most importantly, it was in some ways a response to another branch of sort of geologic writing at the time, which was sometimes referred to as scriptural geology or mosaic geology, which is sort of creation, what we think of in the modern context of creationism. And Lyell very much wanted to sort of stake out that there's a distinction to be made between geology as practiced by the Geological Society and geology as practiced by sort of scriptural geology.
Battle it out.
Yeah, and you know, it's sort of he's an incredible synthesizer, right? That's another sort of really important aspect of Lyell's work. He's amazing at sort of taking and distilling all these ideas into one text and sort of summarizing everything that sort of that progressed up until the 1830s.
Use this textbook university for developing.
I don't know. Actually, that's a great question. You know, the major universities at the time, Lyell actually was for a short time on the faculty at King's College in London, and only for a couple of years. He gave lectures on his principles, and actually, I think that was, I want to say it was before he actually sat down and wrote the principles that provided the fodder for that. So yeah, at least in the classes he was teaching at King's, he would have used his sort of material that he'd been gathering for the principles. You know, there's other sort of prominent members of the Geological Society, such as Buckland, who's at Oxford. So, you know, Buckland is teaching from his sort of, it was very much up to the instructor what they how they wanted to construct their lecture. And not only how they wanted to construct their lecture, but who their lectures were for. Was it just for the students at those particular universities, or could more larger audience come? And so Lyell also made a conscious decision when he was at King's to bring in sort of the wider, to market his lecture topics to a wider audience, not just the students. Okay, we'll move on. Skip this one. So we've now sort of moved from, we're gonna transition from sort of the establishment of the idea layers of the earth had very long-lived history to them. We're gonna talk a little bit about formation, the sort of formation of the idea of how we put absolute ages on all of this stuff. And there's two cases here, 5 and 6, and it's actually really useful to think about attempts pre-discovery of radioactivity to put absolute measurements on how old the Earth was. And a lot of these come from sort of theories of the Earth or geotheorizing, meaning that they were subject to a lot of assumption and conjecture, and that therefore left them very much open to debate and very much unsatisfying. Both today, given what we know about the age of the Earth, but actually back then too, it was very unsatisfying sort of metrics for establishing ages of the Earth. One prominent one, which is shown by a couple of texts here that I really want to focus on, a text by Buffon in his Natural History, and a text by William Thomson or Lord Kelvin in his Treatise on Natural Philosophy. These two texts build off of the cooling of the Earth geotheory. They're both contributing in different ways. So what was that geotheory? It was the idea that the Earth started off as an initially fully molten ball, and steadily through time has cooled off to arrive at its present day condition. Buffon did experiments with molten spheres or very hot spheres of different metals. He clocked, measured how long it took for these things to cool off, and through a lot of assumption and conjecture, standed that up to be sort of a measurement of how old the Earth was. The initial estimates came out in the range of about 70,000 years. Eventually, he revised that up to a few millions of years, which sounds quite short, but again, in context, the context in which Buffon was working for the early part of the 18th century was actually very, very long-lived relative to some of the other estimates of the age of the Earth. In between Buffon and Lord Kelvin, Joseph Fourier also came up with his own cooling theory of the Earth. Slightly more sophisticated set of equations, slightly more sophisticated calculation. And then we arrive at Kelvin, who does sort of the most complete calculation in the late 19th century, he comes up with an initial estimate of 400 million years, and basically over time whittles it down and ends up with an age of about 20 to 40 million years. Very, very long lived, but obviously not anywhere close to the order of magnitude with which we think the age of the Earth is today, right? And Kelvin's estimate is important for a couple of reasons. It had some purchase by some geologists, notably John Phillips, agreed with the estimate. Many geologists did not agree with the estimate, but Kelvin was a force to be reckoned with in sort of the physics world, and therefore he again sort of sets the terms of the debate in the later part of the 19th century. So his age is the 20 to 40 million year age is the one in which all geologists are kind of arguing against and looking for some other metric or some other ways to make the measurement. Okay. One other really interesting thing, I'll just sort of an aside about these cooling theories of the Earth, that's really important to actually think about the fossil record, is that it was thought that this was actually a pretty decent approximation of what had happened because, at least in Europe, fossils from the coal-bearing units were typically tropical in nature. You get to the age of reptiles, those are sort of requiring warmer climates. And then you get to sort of the most recent time in Europe in which there's still some remnant glaciers in the Alps, right? So this idea that the Earth is steadily cooling off was actually somewhat supported by the geologic evidence, or at least in the context in which it was proposed. It's actually another really interesting point that greatly hindered the eventual agreed upon idea that the Earth was actually colder in the Pleistocene, right? That we had large-scale Pleistocene glaciation. Even though that evidence had been accumulated in sort of the middle part of the 19th century, it was very, very hard for geologists to accept that idea because of sort of the prevalence of this steadily cooling of the Earth, right? Everything's getting cooler through time. It can't be that the past was actually colder than the present. Okay. So one more case. Now progress to the 20th century and the discovery of radioactivity by Marie Curie and Henry Becquerel sets the stage for Ernest Rutherford, Soddy to establish their own theories of radioactivity. And that's shown by these two volumes here. One is the facsimile of Rutherford and Soddy's Radioactivity of Uranium. And the other one is the text by Ernest Rutherford on radioactive transformations. And the graph in both of these shows the basic experimental evidence, which is that through time, we see a perfect mirroring between a parent element and a daughter product of the decay. And so you see two exponential curves which perfectly mirror one another. And the key insight there is that this occurs at a constant rate. So if you know the constant at which the decay process occurs, you can measure the parent, you can measure the daughter, and you can back out the time that has progressed as since when that parent is starting to decay away to the daughter. So Rutherford takes this theory of radioactivity and actually makes the first radiometric date from a sample of Fergusonite, Connecticut, which is a uranium-bearing mineral, the uranium-helium date, and he comes up with an estimate after some recalculation of 500 million years. And this is a really important date for a couple of reasons. One, it blows out of the water Kelvin's estimate of 20 to 40. It's much, much older than that. And it's coming from a physicist, right? Which makes it sort of easier to dissuade the fellow physicists of Kelvin's ilk who thought that geologists don't know anything and the physicists know all. And it's actually Rutherford that sort of sets that date and kind of causes geologists to say, see, I told you so, everything's much older than 20 to 40 million, right? The other centerpiece, the other key study I want to talk about in this case is Claire Patterson's Age of the Meteorites of the Earth. This maybe is something that's a little bit less familiar to the non-geochronologists in the audience, but it's this paper that gives us the established age of 4.55 billion years to the age of the universe. Patterson's study is in 1955. His insight is that he can measure two different isotopes or two different flavors of the element lead, one which is produced by uranium-238, one which is produced by uranium-235, He makes those measurements in meteorites, which are the fundamental building blocks of the Earth. In constructing this, he basically makes the lead measurements. He finds that if you string those lead measurements of the meteorites along a plot, they form a line. The slope of that line gives you the age from which those meteorites have progressed through time, from sort of the primordial building blocks of the Earth to the present day. He regresses the slope of the slope. He comes up with two lines. One is 4.5, one is 4.6. He splits the difference and gets 4.55. This is a stupendous result, and it's basically stuck with us as the age of the Earth, the nominal age of the Earth, to the present day. One other really fascinating thing about Patterson is he discovers that making these lead measurements is extremely difficult and near impossible to do in a normal laboratory. So a lot of his work is built around constructing a clean laboratory that will isolate the leads that he's interested in, the meteorites surrounding environment. And actually this progresses into a whole sort of secondary career where he investigates the source of all the lead in the atmosphere and ends with the conclusion that a lot of it is introduced by either lead paint or most importantly by leaded gasoline. Patterson then goes on a bit of a sort of a tour of Congress, and eventually the reason we phased out leads from our gasoline is a direct result of Claire Patterson's work. Okay, one other thing about this research in geochronology continues to the present. These are two images of instrumentation used in the geology department to do geochronologic research at the present day. What I find so fascinating about these, comparing it to some of the earlier cases, is notice how we've progressed from something that is handheld to a sample, a fossil, very large in scale, layering of the Earth, and we are now down to measuring individual atoms on spectrometers to do geochronologic work. We've also progressed from something that is relative dating to something that is absolute high accuracy and precision. Okay, so. Still some time, we want to go take a look at the text there. If people still want, I mean, I was just going to have general discussion. If people on there have questions, but otherwise, I'm just going to sort of mingle.
Okay. Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
We apologize for taking you all around looking at the floor. Very much sorry. We just wanted to say thank you all for attending. Wow, the glare is terrible. Thank you all for attending, and Willie has wrapped up his lecture on the exhibit. This will be posted to RBML's YouTube a couple of days, maybe, just to give us time to download and upload. And then if you have any questions, you can always email askacurator@library.illinois.edu, and we are happy to answer any of those questions. Oh yeah, and you can come see the exhibit live. RBML is open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and you're welcome to stop by. If you have any questions, let us know. Thanks. Have a good day, everyone.